G. David Schine, anti-communist activist, hotel executive, and producer, 1927 to 1996. In 1953, two aides to Senator Joseph McCarthy embarked upon a tour of Europe to brief American diplomatic personnel on the dire threat of communism. Both men were in their mid-20s, but they made for something of an odd pairing. Roy Cohn was short, loud, intelligent, aggressive, and admittedly accomplished. He had been responsible for securing the electric chair for the Rosenbergs through admittedly underhanded means, and he was the most trusted aide of Senator McCarthy, who was then at the height of his power. His companion, David Schine, was his opposite on nearly every conceivable level. Tall, handsome, and with the easy confidence of someone whose place in society was secure from birth, Schine's only accomplishment to date was being the author of a 6-page pamphlet on communism. This thin publication, his friendship with the right-wing columnist George Sokolsky, and a chance encounter with Roy Cohn at a nightclub led to Schine's recruitment as an unpaid chief consultant due to his supposed expertise on communism. Their mission to Europe became a very public, booze-fueled imbroglio and contributed to the downfall of the alcoholic senator from Wisconsin, as Cohn and Schine were frequently late, hungover, uninformed, in Schine's case at least, and belligerently bullying of embassy personnel, threatening to expose those among them who were communist and/or homosexuals. These two wealthy young partisan hacks from Washington, D.C. even forced diplomatic personnel, almost all of them older, more experienced, and more informed, to burn any books in their libraries that they deemed to be subversive. Born on September 11, 1927, to a wealthy Jewish family in Gloversville, New York, Gerard David Schine relied heavily upon his family's name and bank account to make up for his lack of anything remotely resembling ability. Junius Meyer Schine, his father, was a Latvian immigrant who had arrived in New York as an 11-year-old in 1902. His mother, Hildegard Feldman, was born in 1903. David had one brother and two sisters. By the time he was born, Junius Schine was well on his way in building his business empire, Schine Enterprises. Although Junius would primarily be remembered as a hotelier, his holdings were actually quite diverse. When Junius Schine sold his business to investors in 1965, he had 12 hotels, mostly luxury hotels in the downtown areas of large cities, 158 movie theaters, and 3,000 acres of oceanfront property. Although the details of Schine Enterprises' holdings undoubtedly varied over time, the proceeds from the family business were more than sufficient to allow the Schine family to enjoy every advantage and luxury. As a youth, David attended Phillips Academy, an elite boarding school in Andover, outside of Boston. In 1945, Schine enrolled at Harvard University, located in another suburb of Boston, Cambridge. One may safely speculate that he did not earn his admission through his dazzling feats of intellectual excellence. By the 1940s, most students at Harvard resided on campus in a communal fashion. Despite the elite background of most of the students, they would live more or less like normal college students as we think of it while attending the school. Schine, however, was having none of that. Perhaps invoking old traditions, Schine chose to live off campus, as students had during the days prior to World War I. Schine requested permission to use his dorm as an office rather than a residence, a request which was denied by the administration. After he moved into the dorms, under peer pressure, he asked that his female secretary be allowed to attend to his study needs after visiting hours were over. To its credit, Harvard once again denied his request. However, he still had his secretary attend all of his classes to take notes for him. While he did eventually deign to live on campus with the others, he rode around town in a limousine driven by a chauffeur, a luxury that few other students indulged in. Until March 1947, Selective Service was still calling up men for military service as the U.S. military slowly drew down in size after World War II. One of the 183,383 men whose number came up in 1946, Schine took a leave of absence from Harvard in spring 1946 and returned by the fall of 1947, after serving as the assistant purser for the Army Transport Service. This was a civilian role, but it fulfilled his service requirement under the rules of the time. Given how many young men had served during the war, even this would be mildly embarrassing, as there were no combat zones awaiting young Schine in 1946. Of course, he had operated according to the rules, and the alternative that he pursued was one of an array available to all men, regardless of class. Nonetheless, Schine managed to make his light tour of duty into a scandal which would serve to alienate him further from his Harvard classmates. Rather than merely letting his time in the service go unremarked, Schine instead insisted upon presenting himself as a lieutenant in the Army and a veteran when he returned to campus in the fall of 1947. This caused grave offense, as there were a number of students who had fought and bled in Europe and the Pacific. Hearing this entitled, limousine-riding intellectual lightweight steal valor in this way offended a number of his peers. However, since there was no social media to play to, Schine does not seem to have been forced to confess before an Android or iPhone to his misrepresentation of the facts, nor was he pummeled by his peers, at least not to the best of our knowledge. While many of his classmates despised him and had only negative memories of him later, Schine did serve as drum major and conductor for the band during his time at Harvard, so perhaps he finished a little stronger than he started. All things considered, however, he was not among the Ivy League institution's most distinguished graduates. In 1952, Schine composed a 6-page pamphlet called The Definition of Communism and arranged for it to be mass-produced, placing a copy in every one of his father's hotel rooms. As author Joe Conason says, the pamphlet is proof that Schine didn't learn much at Harvard, as he betrays many basic misunderstandings of communism and its chief exponents. Not only did he bungle the dates of the Russian Revolution and the foundation of the Communist Party, but he was also unclear as to who did what. He falsely attributed words and deeds to Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, which rightfully belonged to one of the other members of that group. How a Harvard graduate and self-proclaimed expert on communism could make such basic mistakes is rather baffling. This is one instance where Schine would have been well advised to have stuck with his normal practice of hiring someone else to do his hard work. In spite of the many mistakes Schine made in the pamphlet, his claim of being an expert on the topic of communism was accepted, at least by dedicated anti-communists who cared only about the vehemence of someone's anti-communism, never mind if they understood it on any level. As such, he was able to make friends with columnist George Sokolsky, who introduced him to Roy Cohn, an aide to Senator Joseph McCarthy. They met at a nightclub in New York City. Despite having only worked with the senator for a few months, Cohn had a great deal of sway with him and convinced him to enlist the services of Mr. Schine. This may have been as simple as Cohn wishing to secure the assistance of someone with wealth and name recognition, whom he could use his superior intellect to operate as a puppet. Or perhaps, having lived his life with his nose to the grindstone for so long, Cohn wished to spend time with someone who knew how to live the high life. It is also not inconceivable that Schine gave Cohn butterflies, as we shall see later. Cohn arranged for the two of them to go on an inspection tour around Europe to make sure that embassy personnel were properly educated on the dangers of communism and that their libraries were properly equipped to inform them. They would do a whirlwind tour of American embassies in the capital cities of Europe, interviewing a few people and then meeting with the local press so that their activity would be documented. After reminding the limp-wrist diplomats about their duty, haranguing them on the dangers of communism and homosexuality, and checking their libraries for offensive books, the dynamic duo would then return to their luxury hotels and get ready to explore the nightlife of each city. On the Saturday before Easter in 1953, Cohn and Schine landed at a private airport near Paris to begin their 10-day tour. The next morning, they had mandated that all of the staff of the Paris United States Information Service assemble at 8 a.m. sharp to be briefed. Many of the workers had families and had hoped to spend the holiday with them, so they were hoping for a brief meeting. However, the two young visitors did not show up. Julia Child, whose husband Paul was one of the workers, said that the USIS called the luxury hotel where the young men were staying, only to learn that the two of them were still sleeping after a long night in Paris's cabaret district. Presumably, the meeting never took place because Cohn and Schine were too hungover to attend. They also had to go back a little later to Paris a second time. Julia Child recounted the incident in an interview 38 years after the fact, which shows how strong of a negative impression the two men made on the personnel in Paris. When they visited Frankfurt about a week later, they pulled off a variant of their Paris performance. Having ordered the diplomats to assemble at 8 a.m. sharp, Cohn and Schine did not grace them with their presence until 11 a.m. As the meeting was about to begin, Schine announced to the assembled men that he had put on the wrong trousers, and so he dispatched his driver to go fetch them. Then, before anything substantive had happened, he then announced that he had also forgotten his notebook and told the staff to wait while he and Cohn went back to the hotel. In the lobby, a local reporter saw the two arguing, with Schine hitting Cohn over the head with a rolled-up newspaper before the dynamic duo disappeared in the Schine's room for several minutes. The cleaning staff later reported that Schine's room was covered in ashes and cigarette butts, with all of the furniture overturned. The overall lack of effort put forth by Cohn and Schine while on their junket can be best seen in their efforts to prune the libraries of the USIS. Freda Utley, an anti-communist and an advisor to Senator McCarthy, had instructed them to make sure that certain anti-communist books were added to every USIS collection. Instead of ordering each library to make sure that they had all of the books that Utley saw as essential to warn them against the evils of collectivism, they instead misconstrued her list as a collection of things they needed to purge. Thus, every book which made up a part or a whole of Utley's reading list would be taken from the shelves and then burned in front of the entire staff, who were chastised and humiliated. The anti-communist awareness team succeeded in punishing others for possessing anti-communist literature, and in the process, undermined the legitimacy of the anti-communist project in the eyes of the men and women representing American interest abroad. Their 10-day tour cost about $85,000 in today's money, a sum which does not count the military transportation that they used to travel to Europe. Some officials were hounded out of service at this time, but not a single communist was exposed by Cohn and Schine. Their incompetence was noted not just by the USIS, but by all of America's allies and the European press corps. As the two rapidly made enemies, a future editor of the Washington Post realized that there was a great opportunity to generate a story by allowing Cohn and Schine to embarrass themselves, so he organized a press conference for them, which they foolishly attended. They could not produce satisfactory answers to any questions, even ones about whether they were happy with the work they were doing. British journalists were especially scathing, as they had heard a rumor that the little wankers were threatening to investigate the BBC to expose communists in the ranks of Britain's journalists. A correspondent from the Manchester Guardian, who attended Cohn and Schine's press conference in Rome, wrote a review of it denouncing their limited vocabulary, their self-complacency, and their paucity of ideas, coupled with the immense power they wield, which had the effect of drawing sympathy for all ranks of the United States diplomatic service who had to submit to this sort of thing. A part of the Red Scare was the so-called Lavender Scare, based on the idea that either because communists accepted homosexuality as natural, or because homosexuals could be blackmailed by communist agents, homosexuals were inherently suspect because they were highly likely to either be communist through choice or coercion. For all of their blustering talk of hunting down homosexuals, however, Cohn and Schine only managed to trigger the gaydar of many personnel in the State Department. During their tour of Europe, Cohn and Schine behaved in a peculiar fashion, hitting each other playfully, and generally behaving more like a couple than two friends. They were always late, and they stayed out partying every night. Perhaps the strange behavior came from whatever substances the two were imbibing. But it is also possible that their abnormal interest in the sex lives of embassy workers struck the intended victims as rather queer. Perhaps just out of spite, Shine's limo driver testified that he saw the two men engage in homosexual acts in the limo. Interestingly, in the description of a video on YouTube showing Shine's cameo as himself in a 1968 episode of Batman, the description calls him Roy Cohn's boyfriend, with boyfriend being in quotes, showing that he never lived down the notoriety he attained in Europe. For the record, Roy Cohn was actually gay and quite promiscuous, having his sexuality exposed on national TV by the Army's attorney, and later dying of AIDS in 1986. As for Schine, there is no real evidence that he actually engaged in homosexual activity, but because Roy Cohn proved to be gay, many people always suspected that Schine had at least experimented in his youth with another man. As the Korean War was still ongoing, the 26-year-old Schine was called up for service once again in July 1953, while he was still a part of McCarthy's anti-communist team. The senator and Roy Cohn did everything they could to try to secure an exemption for Schine, or to make sure that his service was as light as possible. They demanded that he be spared most of the basic training that other recruits would receive, given weekend passes every weekend, and they also asked that he be assigned to the CIA so that he would be stationed nearby. By no means could someone as vital as Schine be deployed abroad. McCarthy requested that his special aide be served filet mignon and other delicacies he was accustomed to, and he also made the Army assign him a driver. Forging the senator's signature, Cohn went further, and he also submitted a request with the Army that Schine be admitted to use a bathhouse typically only available to United States senators. In a phone call, Cohn threatened to ruin and expose the Army if they mistreated his good friend, G. David Schine. The only area where McCarthy and Cohn were unable to prevail upon the Army was on the matter of making Schine an officer, as he did not meet the qualifications. Still, he is perhaps the only private in the history of the U.S. Army to have an assigned driver rather than being a driver for someone with actual rank. After his discharge, he and Cohn rented a private office space in D.C. together and split expenses. From April to June 1954, the Army-McCarthy hearings were held in the Senate to resolve outstanding disputes over communists in the ranks, as the U.S. Army and Senator Joseph McCarthy were operating on incompatible sets of facts. McCarthy alleged that the U.S. Signal Corps was full of communists, whereas the Army said that it was tired of McCarthy lobbying so intensely to make Private G. David Schine an officer. The hearings are remembered today for casual homophobia and for the way in which Army Attorney Joseph Welch exposed the flaws in McCarthy's methodology in front of a television audience of perhaps 20 million Americans. G. David Schine was third in importance in those hearings behind McCarthy and Roy Cohn, both of whom took the brunt of the beating. However, Schine's name came up repeatedly, both for his European tour and for the influence peddling on his behalf during his limousine-riding tour of duty the previous year. Cohn argued that Schine had been drafted so that the Army could hold him as a hostage and put a check on McCarthy's investigation into communists in the Army, an argument which failed to convince anyone. Part of McCarthy's political brand was his denunciation of elitism and privilege, so the lobbying and threats of McCarthy and Cohn on behalf of Schine were one of the more embarrassing revelations of the hearings. Schine's name and likeness were featured enough for him to become a B-list celebrity, but one with the kind of negative recognition that today typically requires a not guilty verdict after a vicious crime. While McCarthy was not found guilty of any criminal activity, his popularity dipped and he was censured by the Senate in December. He died 3 years later. As for Roy Cohn, he was the chief counsel to McCarthy during this debacle, assisted by an even younger attorney, Robert F. Kennedy. Welch's suggestions that all of the concern that McCarthy and Cohn evinced for Schine was clearly homosexual in nature made them all the objects of ridicule. Rumors began to spread far and wide, not just the common one about Cohn and Schine, but also about the possibility of McCarthy having been lovers with one or other of the younger men. For Cohn, this accusation struck uncomfortably close to home, as he had been trying all his life to beard himself by denouncing homosexuality every chance he got. His abuses of power and the widespread rumors that he was gay convinced him that it was time to take his talents back to New York, where he had been a very successful, if very shady, lawyer, representing mobsters and then going on to mentor a young Donald Trump. As for G. David Schine, he had his family's wealth, but his reputation was badly damaged on both a personal and professional level. In the wake of the Army-McCarthy hearings, which were profoundly embarrassing for Schine, one might expect that few high-status women would have a strong interest in a man who was exposed to the world as a clown. Yet, Schine would somehow manage to win the affection of one of the most sought-after women on the planet just a year after he was eviscerated on national television. Hillevi Rambin was a Swedish decathlon winner, who then entered the world of beauty pageants. At age 22 in 1955, Rambin won Miss Sweden, and then proceeded to compete for the honor of becoming Miss Universe. She won that contest as well, thus becoming the fourth woman to bear the title. Her contract as Miss Universe included some guaranteed appearances in Hollywood films. During her world tour in 1955, she met Schine, and the two of them fell in love. Despite the fact that she was talented and beautiful and could have any rich man she wanted, Hillevi decided to spend her life with David. She made 2 brief appearances in a couple of films before announcing that she was going to nip her acting career in the bud so that she could focus instead on being Mrs. G. David Schine. The couple were married in 1957. They went on to have 6 children together, and they remained married for nearly 40 years. Contrary to any reasonable expectation, they appear to have enjoyed a happy marriage. Without a doubt, marrying Hillevi Rambin is far and away G. David Schine's greatest achievement. In Russia, there's a folk proverb that says, "Love is cruel. One can even love a goat." For the goat, Schine in this instance, love was exceedingly not cruel. In 1957, despite David's negative reputation after the McCarthy hearings, Junius Schine decided to retire, and he named his son as the new head of the company. One imagines that the elder Schine was either duly impressed by his son managing to snare a supermodel, or perhaps he was merely relieved that no one was seriously accusing David of being a homosexual anymore. Still young and with a glamorous wife, Schine was photogenic, and he became one of the better-known young executives in the country during the late 50s and early 60s. However, in 1963, Junius returned to replace his son as president and arranged for the sale of the company. Whether David performed well or not in his role as president is unclear. More to the point, whether David acquiesced in his father's return and the sale of the family business empire is also unclear, but it is certainly possible that he did approve of his father's actions. In any event, it appears that by the end of the 60s, a desire for artistic acclaim had overtaken Schine, and he would use his sufficient resources on the monetary front to make his way into the entertainment business. He would primarily work as a producer, and he would find some actual success in the world of entertainment during the 1970s. Schine Music was probably his most famous and successful venture, and it makes sense when one considers that Schine himself was a skilled musician. Some of his biggest signings include R&B singer Lou Rawls, teen idol Bobby Sherman, who actually just passed away on June 24, 2025, and perhaps most notably, the DeFranco family, who achieved gold and platinum level record sales. Still self-indulgent, however, Schine pulled some strings to conduct the Boston Pops Orchestra in place of the legendary Arthur Fiedler during the 25th anniversary of his graduating class at Harvard. Some of the musicians present refused to play for him due to his McCarthyite past, with one of the abstaining musicians commenting that Schine's actions had ruined his father's life. He had a few different businesses in the world of movies and television. Studio Television Services was a post-production company that counted Disney, MGM, and HBO among its clientele base. Schine also served as president of High Resolution Sciences Incorporated. This publicly traded company lobbied for improving the definition of television broadcast. Notably, it also developed a technology to correct chromacrawl, a flaw with early color television sets which made it look like dots were constantly moving up the screen. Schine worked on 3 television and movie projects between 1968 and 1977, which is in keeping with his rather relaxed work ethic and dilettantism. In 1968, he made a 1-minute cameo in Batman Season 3, Episode 25, The Entrancing Dr. Cassandra, a show starring Adam West. G. David Schine introduced himself using his real full name, but portrayed himself as the manager of Spiffany's, a jewelry store whose real-life inspiration is destined to remain shrouded in mystery, just like the identity of the Caped Crusader. He actually shared a wide shot with the episode's villain, her male accomplice, Batman, Robin, and Batgirl. One imagines that a few parents watching with their children may have guffawed at the idea of a superhero coming to the aid of such a noted and upstanding citizen. As for his acting chops, his stilted and flat delivery of his lines was no better and no worse than the on-screen performance of Harold P. Warren, a Texas businessman who wrote, produced, and starred in Manos the Hands of Fate a couple years earlier. In 1971, Schine's production company, Schine More, teamed with Philip D'Antoni Productions to fund The French Connection, an adaptation of the crime thriller novel by Robin Moore, released 2 years earlier. Directed by William Friedkin and starring Roy Scheider and Gene Hackman, the crime thriller made both the 1998 and 2007 list of the 100 greatest American films ever made, as determined by the United States National Film Registry. The French Connection has a rating of 7.7 out of 10 on IMDb as of June 2025. In addition to the critical acclaim it garnered, the movie also proved to be profitable. Costing about $2 million to make, the movie brought in $75 million at the box office. Perhaps buoyed by the success of The French Connection, or simply wishing to pay homage to the films that he enjoyed, Schine co-wrote, produced, and directed a 1977 documentary on action films called That's Action. Unlike most films with a central narrative, Schine's documentary instead is mostly a collection of clips from action movies with a fairly thin thread of narration to connect those clips. The focus is on the films of Mr. John Wayne. Today this documentary is mostly forgotten, and what little interest it excites is wound up in the involvement of G. David Schine. Shortly after this film's release, Schine officially declared himself to be retired, although he would continue to work sporadically on different things for the remaining 19 years of his life. Later in his life, not only did Schine improve his reputation in general and add items to his resume which were not scandalous, but he actually managed to make a positive impression on some of his peers as a man. Eschewing the far-right politics of Roy Cohn, Schine aligned himself with the more mainstream part of the Republican Party. To be clear, he never apologized for his past. In a 1975 interview, Schine stated, "I didn't think we were doing enough in this country to express our ideals and objectives. I just did it to serve my country." Although he was known for ostentation as a young man, the older Schine was more approachable, and along with his wife and kids, had a reputation for being fairly personable. The Schine family were tight-knit, as all 6 adult children and the 4 grandchildren would meet together to go out to dinner or to go to outdoor outings. He and his wife had donated money to charitable causes over the years, and Halevi volunteered in the clothing section of a major history museum, as she had become something of an expert on historical clothing. She also designed women's shoes and held a few patents. In June 1996, G. David Schine boarded a plane with his wife and one of his sons, Frederick Barrett Schine, who was a certified pilot and a former official under both Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. David was also a pilot, and he may have been at the controls of this private plane during the flight to upstate California. The trio were heading to scout locations for a theatrical run of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. At this time, Schine was also attempting to assemble an anthology of Republic Studio newsreels to create a series called Saturday Matinee. Neither of these projects would come to fruition, however. Their propeller-driven aircraft experienced mechanical difficulties, and they crashed just off the side of a highway. He was 69 years old at the time of his passing, and while every obituary focused on his involvement in the scandals of the McCarthy era, the Los Angeles Times effectively said that he had redeemed his youthful transgressions in the 4 decades since he had embarrassed the whole country. One cannot escape the feeling, however, that in spite of Schine having cleaned up his act and image to some extent, he still never managed to endear himself to any considerable degree, and no one outside the family had wet cheeks when they learned about his end.